Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we want to welcome back a very special guest. Today we have Kirk Schneider. He's a leading spokesperson for contemporary existential humanistic and existential-integrative psychology. And Dr. Schneider was a 2022 candidate for president of the American Psychological Association, a co-founder and current president of the Existential-Humanistic Institute, an award-winning psychotherapy training center, and a two-term member of the Council of Representatives of the APA. He's written several books, including Existential-Humanistic Therapy, Depolarizing America, The Spirituality of Awe, and his newest book, available on February 1st, is called Life-Enhancing Anxiety, Key to a Sane World. Welcome back, Kirk. Thank you for coming on.
It's great to be here with both of you. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I want to first off shout out the fact that this is your third time on our show, which is really excellent because we've only had about, I think, a handful of three-time guests. So I think you're number 5. I think you are the 5th ever third-time guest. So it's really awesome to have you back. Okay, so as we usually start out, we start out with a quote. And in this case, I'm going to read a quote from Kurt's newest book, Life Enhancing Anxiety. So Kurt wrote, "We humans need to get our act together concerning anxiety. Our attempts to block anxiety, pretend it doesn't exist, or propel ourselves in the opposite direction have been a disaster, and we're continuing to perpetuate that disaster now. Just think about how many problems anxiety denial has brought us. Tyrannical leaders, imperious states, remorseless bigots, hateful ideologues, merciless financial moguls, soulless intellects, reckless industrialists, robotic bureaucrats, heartless abusers, and mindless addicts. In fact, all who have pursued the quick fix, instant results approach to living bear this legacy, and of course, that includes every one of us at one time or another. Think, for example, how many of us have been attracted to the simplistic and expedient, whether through petty squabbles, crass commercialism, fast food, speedy internet, smart TVs, ingenious phones, pills, apps, sports channels, slogans, fashion, hero worship, or guns. But it is strikingly a matter of degree, is it not? So I love that. And I want to kind of, as we begin, I want to start to differentiate between the different forms of anxiety. So, clinically speaking, I think all of us know this, especially even in popular culture, that, most of the time anxiety is viewed as something to be subdued, subjugated, to be kind of medicated away. One could go to therapy for it. Obviously, in some ways, if you're talking about quick fixes, it's easy to start binge watching television shows, binge eating food. There are kind of so many different remedies for it. So can we first start by differentiating between what that type of anxiety is like, the clinical version of it, and then your version of it, which you obviously call life enhancing anxiety, and how do the two, if they do, kind of tie into one another and even feed off of each other in a way?
Yeah, well, I see it all on a spectrum of intensity. So what we would call clinical anxiety is often anxiety that's more intense. And when I say anxiety, I mean basically fear of the unknown, terror of the unknown. So clinical anxiety is such terror of the unknown, and I've had it myself. I mean, I'm sure I could have been labeled that many years ago. Is an intense terror of the unpredictable, the uncertain. I think it's often associated with death anxiety. Certainly was for me. The way I translate death anxiety is a primal sense of groundlessness and helplessness, and that feeling comes up often through psychological trauma. It can come up through loss, illness. There are many ways where we could feel like the bottom has dropped out and we're just floundering, we're grasping, and we're in a free fall kind of thing. So that free fall is particularly intense in clinical anxiety to the point where many would call it irrational. Irrational anxiety. So terror of a spider, terror of somebody from a different country, or just a terror of somebody or something that's different, and that paralyzes one. And we can go into this later, but I do trace a lot of this terror back to what Otto Rank would call the trauma of birth.
Mm-hmm.
I think we all experience it at a certain point, at that point where we're thrown into the world. But it's a question of how that's handled by the caretakers, by the culture that one enters into, and the degree of trauma that takes us back into that place of groundlessness and helplessness, and of course, how that's handled. But clinical anxiety is often untreated anxiety, if you will. For me, it had a lot to do with the death of my brother, which I think I have talked about on your show before at a very young age.
Yeah, and please, actually, I was going to ask you to go into it a little bit today too. So, I mean, we did focus on it a little bit, but it wasn't in any depth. And I actually appreciate the experiences that you had with your early psychoanalyst too. So, as we're kind of defining anxiety and differentiating the two, yeah, please, if you want to use this as an example to connect the two, go ahead.
Right. So, I would say that I had that extreme clinical anxiety, the sense of overwhelm, probably up to when I was about 6 years old. My brother died when I was about 2.5, and he was 7. And I went into a tailspin between 2.5 and 6 years old, roughly the time that my mother, in her wisdom, referred me to a child analyst. And I'm sure that he was extremely helpful to me in kind of moving me from a place of clinical anxiety, abject terror and paralysis, absolute terror of death and dying, of germs, of the unknown. I had night terrors, visions of being attacked, monsters, especially as a kid's mind will,
Right, and that would be the basic clinical phobias.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a point where one is like walking around the world with a constant startle response and being on the edge of panic or in panic, and having a great difficulty coping.
Mm-hmm.
Coping with everyday, practical activities because of the degree of tension, of nervousness, and again, primal fear that one will not be able to handle it. I mean, frankly, it's like being on the edge of insanity, I think. I mean, that was my sense of it, that I was going to be lost. And actually, my father, who was a humanistic educator, was a middle school teacher at the time, actually took notes on me because he was afraid that I was losing touch with reality in some ways. I was crying constantly. I was enraged. I was out of control in a lot of ways for a little kid. And what my psychoanalyst did, I think, in terms of what really stood out, was he helped me to move incrementally from a place of abject terror and paralysis in many ways to gradual incremental curiosity about my situation, because he would ask me questions about what was going on for me, and I would be probing more about it and realizing as I'm inquiring, as I'm looking at my struggle, seeing more aspects to it, that maybe it's not quite as harrowing as I at first thought. He's not as scary as I thought. My mother is not as scary. I did have some profound fears, and I go into that in the book, of my mother, which I think is understandable, with her being so connected to my brother, and he was the firstborn, and And we had, I think she had a great deal of difficulty, especially in the early stages, even relating to me. She had to get away for a period of time. I don't at all want to reduce it to that, because she was a wonderful mother, overall, and she really, I think, did her best to raise me. But there were some great sort of gaps in my experience, and so he helped me to gradually begin to maybe even be intrigued with some of the profound issues that I was faced with. I've often said that I didn't really experience a midlife crisis, because I feel like I experienced it when I was 2.5 years old, which may seem very strange. But I don't think Jung is always right that we experience it at middle age.
Mm-hmm.
Those of us who are traumatized very early encounter these big questions about life and death, and what's this all about, and how do I live, how do I survive with some degree of coherence and meaning and even joy, asking these questions at a young age. And I think his presence, especially his seasoned way of relating to me, and my sense that he had been through a lot himself, but he still had a bit of a sense of humor. He obviously survived a lot that he had gone through. He was caring with me. He really tuned in to me, and he gave me a space to feel free or freer to go anywhere I needed to go, and yet feel supported. So I think all of that helped me to move more toward what I'm calling in the book life enhancing anxiety. The bigger picture of anxiety that can actually be a gateway to healing and liberation, and not just constraint and dread.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what happened with you, in contrast to what many people in society do, which is sort of look for either a quick fix or repress or suppress their emotions. They look to they either have drug-seeking behavior, or maybe they're prescribed something that sort of dulls the senses. In some critical cases, those things can be incredibly helpful. Don't get me wrong, but there are many cases where it's not. It keeps somebody from sort of facing what it is, those primordial emotions, so to speak. And what happened with you, which is very interesting to me, is that through the process of inquiry, through the process of rapport building with your therapist, he actually got you to sort of engage with those feelings and move from a place where it's like, everything's sort of out of control, like I'm at the effect of everything, whereas opposed to when you started to question the things that you were going through, or not question, or sort of answer his questions and get you thinking about what it is that you're feeling. It brought you to this place where you could sort of make sense of the mystery, sort of, so to speak, but then also moved even further to a place where you could be comfortable with embracing mystery, which many of us aren't, which I find very interesting.
Right. And Kirk,
go ahead.
What was it about his presence that made you able to kind of hold those somewhat, seemingly negative emotions? Because for many of us, as Alan said, and as we've been saying, that we want to kind of run away from them. So what was it about the therapy itself that made you feel like, okay, I can kind of be in this space with him and I can tolerate these?
Well, again, I think it had a lot to do with my sense that he was a very seasoned and present person himself, that he was okay with the great storms, the ups and downs of what I was going through. When I say he's okay, he stayed relatively centered, relatively supple, in that process. And I think as a model, he was a great model for me as someone who could not only withstand the storms of these great fears, but who was thriving in significant ways. I mean, he's obviously a very authoritative and accomplished person too. And I wouldn't say just him. It was my second existential analyst when I was in graduate school, who may have been equally important and maybe even more important.
Was that Anne? Was that Anne?
Yes, that was Anne, and I talk about Anne in the book. She was wonderful, powerful, strong, humorous, radically open to whatever I wanted to explore, including very much with her. You know, so, and the fact that she was a woman helped me to explore more about my own anxieties, challenges with my mother, you know, and some of the primal fears I had around abandonment and
well, and then when did you start making that shift in terms of your perspective of anxiety? When did you start viewing it or stop viewing it as something to be medicated away or to be avoided, as opposed to now something that can be enhancing in terms of your life? You know, if you want to kind of conceptualize it as post-traumatic growth, obviously that's kind of a more recent term. But when did you start seeing it as something that could actually be kind of fostered and cultivated in a way to help you?
Well, it took a long time to really come into that place fully. I think I felt the seeds of that after my early analysis at 6 years old, and beginning to become intrigued with the science fiction shows. I've talked about that with you in the past, I think. You know, peculiar states of mind and peculiar creatures and strange places, the mysteries of life that these shows portrayed in fuller dimensions than just as scary creatures. They often had a wisdom to them or insights. In other words, I was gradually seeing the more of what initially just seemed like a catastrophe, and coming into places that looked like groundlessness and helplessness at first. But on the flip side of that, we're also great ranges to explore and to grow in and through. And I think it began to, you know, turn me on to the arts and humanities. I was very interested in creative writing. I did a lot of creative stuff around tapes, stories with my dad, and the toys I had, and made up my own stories, but eventually found psychology putting a lot of that together. Fascination with that.
Yeah, and I think because so Alan is more of a fan of this than I am, but I think we can agree that in terms of horror films, it's sort of a way to us kind of project our anxiety onto the screen just to see, I guess, in some ways to see what it's like or to simulate it. Like I know Alan, you love this stuff. Is that the sense you get?
I don't know where you got that I love horror
You
films
don't?
I love fantasy. I love, I mean, definitely movies like The Fountain or really cerebral movies have spoken to me. Mr. Nobody, things like that. But horror, I mean,
I'm off. Yeah, because I figured because of the sci-fi stuff, they usually go hand in hand. People who love sci-fi love horror at the same time.
it depends, it has a time and place as far as that goes. I've liked horror movies before. I wouldn't say it's my thing, but sorry, but what point were you sort of
Yeah. So,
steering towards?
and let me just now get into what I was going to ask Kirk then. So, Kirk, do you kind of sense that that's sort of what we're doing in some way? So, if we're thinking about life-enhancing anxiety, obviously we're not going to, find ourselves in many of the kind of situations or simulations of a horror film. But can we say that in a way that's for us a way to get kind of comfortable with existential anxiety? Because if we're thinking about if we're thinking about horror films, I mean, essentially we're dealing with topics that we don't normally think about. So, death, obviously kind of the fear of being harmed and pain, the fear of kind of groundlessness in the sense of like, if you look at something like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I mean, there's not really a blueprint for how these people can escape the house. They just have to kind of figure it out themselves, right? So you find these existential themes in horror films.
Oh, absolutely. And I wrote a book about horror and the holy, wisdom teachings of monster tale. So I explored those existential themes. Yeah, I mean, I tend to identify more with what I call classic horror books and films rather than the kind of slice and dice films. But those have that element of mystery as well. But when I say classic horror books and films, I'm talking about what H.P. Lovecraft calls cosmic fear. And I think stories like Frankenstein and Dracula bring that up. These deeper, profound existential questions about extension of life, the field of the mind, potential ways that we can evolve as beings or not. Cautionary tales. But I did want to say one other thing about what I went through as distinct from what many people, many young kids today would likely go through, and I would have likely gone through if I had this experience today or the last several years. First of all, I would probably be bombarded with drugs. I would probably seeing an analyst or a depth therapist would be seen as an extreme luxury or quite unusual for many children today, and maybe to even many professionals, it would be seen as being off track. Why would you put a kid through such torment and struggle and pain when we could give them a mood stabilizer or some kind of an antidepressant to help, anti-anxiety, or just a quicker remedy to work with them. So I think that's a really important piece in terms of how we're handling anxiety today, and also the potential cost of that. But when we're talking about life-enhancing anxiety, I think we're moving more toward that. So the question for me is really, how do we cultivate greater presence to that which is radically other and different in our experience? And again, I trace that back to what we all experience at birth. I wouldn't call it the trauma of birth as Rank does. I call it the drama of birth, because I don't think birth is just a trauma. There are very strong traumatic elements. Move from a state of relative non-being and unity to sudden abrupt being and disunity. Pandemonium, what the kid comes into all kinds of buzzing, blooming world of confusion, right? So that is primarily horrifying, but also what I sense happens at birth are elements of wonder and discovery. And I certainly felt that presiding at the birth of my son. But, this is obviously a tough issue for all of us to go back to what was it actually like at birth. But we do have a lot of indication that it was extremely stressful. And, studies have indicated that too. The stress hormones that are released are much higher than even severe adult stress hormones. Right. And then we have all the studies of how quickly kids deteriorate when, let's say, their mother has a still face. It's called the still face experiments, and they've done that as much as a couple of hours after birth. So when there's nobody there to really meet the child and to hold them, to create a holding environment where they can begin to kind of sink into all that radical terror of difference, of otherness, other things, people, places, stranger anxiety, it's also called.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have that mirroring, that connection, that resonance from the caretaker and from the culture. If they're coming from a fear-based place, then it just sets things off from the beginning on a problematic track and disposes people toward extremes.
Yeah, and so what I love is that when we kind of now differentiate between the various forms of unconscious, as you're starting out in terms of, let's say, the birth or the kind of the birth experience and the distinction between, and this is kind of very polar, where you have to distinguish between non-being and being. I love that what you're doing here is so different from Freud and so different from what we're used to in terms of the unconscious. So we're used to thinking about the unconscious as sort of these kind of infantile drives or desires, where you're fundamentally kind of suppressing them. That's sort of what the ego is all about, or the super ego, and then the ego is essentially managing between the two. But what you think about it when you kind of consider is so much more fundamental. So we're talking about an existential unconscious, which is a little bit different from Jung, and it's different from the collective unconscious, which is a bunch of archetypes that essentially are kind of, let's say, fundamentally within all of us in terms of like some sort of basis. But you're talking about an existential unconscious, which is essentially saying that this is all of life, that these are the parts of life that fundamentally we're coming more and more into contact with and more into awareness of. But it's terrifying. It's incredibly scary. And I like that you link the two together. So there's life-changing or kind of life-enhancing anxiety, and then there's the existential unconscious. So I don't want to kind of get into this too much because I want you to define it, Kirk. So can you tell us what the existential unconscious is and how do we confront it? And if we can confront it on a daily basis?
Yes, and just to respond to your notion of, I mean, you're mentioning the existential unconscious. Yes, I think that's an exciting sort of new perspective for depth psychotherapy, psychology, to look at our relationship to existence, to the cosmos, not only to the parental system or the cultural system or our drives, etc. That feels like bedrock in a lot of ways. So my definition, I have several definitions of life-enhancing anxiety. And more formally, I would define it as that which enables us to live with and make the best of the depth and mystery of existence. So it's that degree of anxiety that helps us to live with and make the best of the depth and mystery of existence. And here you could bring horror films in too. I mean, bring that element of mystery or any suspense, mystery, mysterious film, or that brings that element. And great films often do. How do we find our way in it? Can we find the richness of engaging with that dimension? Less formally, maybe more practically speaking, I would define it as that degree of invigorating anxiety that includes not only apprehension and constraint, but also elements of wonder and discovery. We often equate anxiety with the apprehension and constraint, nervousness. But we don't, in our culture, often see it in its multidimensionality of being potentially a gateway to a larger experience of living. I mean, Rollo May talks about it beautifully in Freedom and Destiny, where he talks about freedom and anxiety are two sides of the coin. You don't have one without the other. It's basically what I understand he's saying is that anxiety can be a signal that we're on the edge of discovery. We're on the edge of something, again, that's radically unknown, that's radically different, other. And the question is, can we be present enough to that moment to begin to come into that otherness, explore it, and see what it holds for us. So life enhancing anxiety, as I elaborate in the book, I believe can really help us to achieve greater states of ethical attunement,
Mm-hmm.
bridge building among cultures. A creative richness opens up our capacity to play, to be creative, to experience novel ideas, feelings, sensations, etc., and begin to apply them in our lives. And also can foster a greater, I think, interpersonal engagement, enable us to become more intimate
Mm-hmm.
with each other, because intimacy certainly can imply a great deal of mystery and difference, otherness, and also potentially can foster greater spiritual fulfillment in terms of our relationship to all that is, to the cosmos.
Mm-hmm.
And I have that whole chapter on everyday spirituality, sense of awe.
What's interesting is when I think about this, if I had to think about this in my own sort of personal experience, right? Anytime that I've actually sort of faced a fear, or actually first, if I had to think about the process, first there comes the feeling of fear, and then this sort of impulse to want to sort of shrink back and not necessarily. I almost want to avoid doing the action. And then there's something in me that, let's pretend that I'm actually facing the fear. There's something in me that wants to, how should I put this? Well, there are a lot of other processes kind of going on at the same time. For instance, I already have some intellectual background knowledge where it's like, oh, this is the ego, it's kind of holding you in place, right? This is the false self. This is essentially something that's not you, that's keeping you constrained and keeping you from sort of expanding and going beyond your imagined limits, right? So I personally, I have this sort of intuitive sense that I don't want to go with that path. I don't want to actually shrink back. I don't want to limit myself. I'd also prefer as much as possible to be authentic, right? Which I know is a lofty sort of a term, but in reality, though, that's the sense I get. So that kind of helps me to then get a little bit of maybe not even courage right away. It depends how fearful I am. If I'm incredibly fearful about something, I might actually think about it for quite a long time before even taking the action. I might even have to, depending exactly how fearful I am, maybe even go through emotions of like anger, pride, and then eventually get to courage, where I might then take the action I need to take. But essentially, what I want to say is that what you're talking about, it does remind me of any time that I've sort of tried to face my fears, and then any times that I've actually done that, I've seen sort of the other side of it, like this possibility. For instance, oh, I told that girl that I was in love with, how I felt about her, and yes, I was scared. I almost didn't do it. I thought of a million reasons not to do it, but then I did it, and then it led to us, getting together and so on, right?
Yeah.
And if I didn't do it, then I would have closed myself off to a whole field of possibility, to
Exactly.
connection, right? And and fulfillment. And it's very interesting to see what happens when you can actually sort of engage with that anxiety, and even if it takes you some time, not to be discouraged by it, but try not to essentially shrink back from it. Ultimately, it depends how much fear you have, but facing it, it's so rewarding. essentially.
And Kirk, and just to because I want to kind of add on to that a little bit and ask a question. So that makes me now start thinking about these kind of like, let's say, broad strokes, right? These broad-based ideas. Now we're talking existentially, the things that most of us are afraid of. Well, let's say intimacy, like Alan pretty much just mentioned. We're afraid of intimacy, rejection, adventure, even heartache, pain, suffering. Would you say that these kind of constructs are what the collective, not the collective, because I mean that's more of a Jungian term, but let's say it's still kind of collective, the collective sort of existential unconscious. What does that comprise of? Is it those elements?
Well, which elements are you referring
Right.
to?
So we're talking about, let's say, the fear of intimacy, the fear of adventure, the fear of risk taking, the fear of, going to the other side, let's say crossing kind of the proverbial river and seeing what's on the other end. Yeah.
I believe so. Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, my life and my professional experience tell me that what Otto Rank calls Urangst, that primal severance, again, from relative non-being or quiescence and unity to sudden abrupt being and pandemonium, sort of shadows forth or looms behind and beneath just about everything that drives us toward what I'd call the polarized mind, which is the fixation on single points of view to the utter exclusion of competing points of view.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very broad-based notion, which can cover everything from tyrannical leaders to people kind of skimming over, deeper encounters in life, like you were talking about earlier, Al.
Mm-hmm.
Staying on the surfaces of things. I do think that it has a lot to do with many of us not having available people, helpful witnesses. Alice Miller put it that way. Helpful witnesses like depth therapists, or maybe even caring neighbors or mentors who have traveled this rather challenging road themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and can offer a model of how one can be present, can survive, and even thrive in those places that we generally have a reflex against going to,
Mm-hmm.
I do think, to your question, Leon, I think that basically that's the nub of it, at least for many of us. Not everybody has a desire or capacity to encounter that degree of primal anxiety that may be driving them to the extreme behavior, if you want to call it that, polarized behavior. But for many people, until they can move into that intensive place where they're encountering that radical otherness in themselves and between themselves and the world, that they're not likely to be able to make fundamental and enduring shifts, I believe, in their lives.
Right.
And again, there are many paths toward that. Meditation could be another, and even the artistic path could be.
I love that. I love that so much because oftentimes existentialism is represented as kind of like a form of rugged individualism. So we tend to think of, right. So we tend to think of the existential, being or man or however, as somebody who's sort of fully endowed and fully in charge of themselves, and they don't necessarily need anybody. And the world is sort of beckoning to them, and they kind of say, "Oh, we don't care. I don't care about you. I can take care of myself. I don't need you." So, but what you say is essentially that we fundamentally need people. And that kind of makes me think about even this podcast and the way that Alan and I feed off of each other. So, he and I talked about this before. It's not something I ever mentioned on the show, but we talked about it in private. So, even though I've done episodes before on my own with people, I mean, Alan's been on guests, he had guest appearances on other people's shows. So, this is just my perspective. It's not necessarily his. So, even though I've done episodes with people one on one, I've always said that it felt like something was fundamentally missing in those episodes. The guests were wonderful. They were really great. I had great conversations with people, but it wasn't the same, you know? So I remember telling Alan, I said, if I ever have to do this podcast on my own, I think I would just stop doing it. It doesn't feel the same. It's not as fun anymore. And
It's
I
the
feel like
beauty of friendship.
right, right.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of what we do here is we kind of feed off of each other. And so not only just in terms of the praise and obviously, you know, the good parts, like the compliments and whatnot, and, you know, the laughter and the fun and all of that is great, but also even in terms of the critical feedback that we give one another. And I love, again, that when you're thinking existential, you know, again, we're thinking about it in terms of isolation, usually like, oh, there's this unbridgeable gap between you and I, and we're fundamentally alone. And you kind of say, yeah, sure, that's true. But then there's this other deeper part that you have to also focus on. Sure, there's an unbridgeable gap, but we really need each other.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. I call it finding ground within groundlessness.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that ground can be so sacred. That bridge, and fulfilling. I just think of, well, some of the patients that I've had, and even in my own life, when we've come to a place of feeling really connected with each other or within ourselves, there's few, you know, greater places or feelings I think that one can have.
And
Yeah,
this is apologies, Leon, but out of curiosity, I mean, it's something I'm wondering about. So the thing is that a lot of people tend to try to, whether consciously or unconsciously, sort of repress the emotions that they may feel by looking to some sort of stimuli, right? Whether it be drugs or something maybe they're prescribed, which is some of the things we've discussed. But what's interesting to me is that you could argue that, you know, other stimuli like social media, for instance, right? Like constantly watching videos, right? If you're bored, you don't necessarily sit with that boredom, right? And try to pursue maybe something that, you know, would be more purposeful, or something that's just higher for you, whatever that would be. You sort of just look to that next stimulus just to satisfy this craving for essentially more dopamine, or just some kind of entertainment. Um, do you think that if people maybe try to sort of distance themselves also from how much they consume, essentially, whether it be social media or food or drugs, that can sort of help bring them to that place where they can actually sit and sort of be with their anxiety? Yeah, I was wondering your thoughts on that.
Like how we can help people to sit with that anxiety.
Yeah, because essentially, I mean, because here's the thing. I mean, if somebody, for instance, just automatically goes to their phone, you know, when they're bored, and they don't necessarily have something they have to do. It's just sort of just to satisfy this
Right.
feeling of lack, or they just want some sort of entertainment. Entertainment's great and all, of course,
Yes, and
but
I want to mention that too. That I think that sure, it's wonderful to have times where one is zoning out. I like watching games.
same.
Yeah,
So yes, there's a sort of a balance there, of
exactly.
course, and there's a value to it, and things that you can learn from, whether it be video games or watching those videos on your phone, or watching like sports. But there's a certain level to it where somebody just kind of does it just to
Yeah.
satisfy sort of that need. And I wonder if sort of stepping away from that would help them sort of feel these feelings that they, you know, may not be
Yeah,
in tune with.
dealing with the terror of boredom, essentially.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. I mean, what I believe we're talking about here is the difference between a kind of mindful approach to distractions, if you will,
Yeah.
entertainments, where one is recognizing that one is, you know, enjoying this time of zoning out, or, you know, being distracted, or maybe even using it as a time to regroup after a
Sure.
stressful, you know, day. Uh, So the distinction between that and compulsively engaging in the action, like addictions, reflexively conditioned, like a conditioned response, basically machine-like. So one way to work with that, if one's willing and able, is to simply make it, set your intentions to stop yourself for even a few moments from going to that television or going to that computer, and take a couple of breaths and just pause for a moment and check in with, okay, how am I doing? What's going on here? What am I feeling? What am I sensing, thinking, imagining? Excuse me. If one does that even a few times, it could be a very enriching discovery, a discovery experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think when you're thinking about, or when we're talking existentially about kind of cultivating or creating meaning, it's not the same thing as compulsive meaning, where we're sort of we're preoccupied with productivity. Because I think a lot of times that people misconstrue the two, or they kind of conflate the two, and they misconstrue what existential meaning is. So a lot of times, like with my patients, they would say something like, "Well, I'm doing something meaningful. So yes, I'm afraid of boredom, but that's great because if I weren't afraid of boredom, I wouldn't be doing all of these other things." And I think that's so different, because to say that one is just checking something off a list is not the same thing as having some overarching goal or overarching value that you're fighting, or maybe not fighting, but at least that you're working toward. And again, a lot of times what happens is people think just because I'm being productive, it's the same thing as doing something meaningful. And I think you would disagree, Kirk, that those two aren't necessarily the same things.
Oh, very much.
Right.
Very much. I resonate with what you're saying. But it's so seductive out there today because we have so many commercial products that advertise that they're meaningful, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have all these toys and games and devices that at one level, they captivate us. They stimulate us, like you were saying before. They activate the dopamine, right? So they can kind of give us the illusion that's meaningful, or that's a kind of maybe joyful experience, and maybe it is at times. I don't want to, not playing God here and imposing all this on one's individual experience, but too often I believe we see that it's illusory, and that it's kind of a thin milk. And in the long run, it's the kind of thing that can lead to the kind of skyrocketing rates of depression, anxiety, addictions, obsession, compulsions that we see in the culture.
Yeah.
Or I think the over identifications with certain ideologies. I mean, ideologies in our cultures have almost become like religions.
Yeah.
Fanaticisms, the vicarious living through ideologues, especially ones who seem to promise the moon.
Right.
Instant answers with a capital A.
Right. So what you're saying,
Dangerous.
I think, right. So what you're saying, I think, is that there's this sort of this profound fear that exists for all of us, outside of, let's say, specific anxieties. Again, when we're thinking about it in terms of intimacy, death, kind of, taking risks and venturing out into other parts of the world. So what I love is now, kind of as we're getting through the book, now we're going into something called existential psychotherapy. So I want to kind of read a passage first, and then I want to ask you a question. So Kurt writes, psychologists today talk until they're blue in the face about path formulas and programmatic treatments. They can cite chemical imbalances in the brain, for example, or the lack of ability to regulate emotions, or the irrationality of conditioned thoughts as the bases for our disorders. However, until psychologists get down to the fundamental problem that fuels all of these secondary conditions, our precariousness as creatures, they will be operating at a very restrictive level. The work I did with Janice had elements of this very restrictive level, and that was important work to accomplish. However, there are questions that need to continually be raised. Is helping a person to change behavior patterns and recondition thoughts enough? Or do we owe it to that person to make available a deeper dimension of self-exploration? Do we owe it to that person to enable discovery of what really matters about his or her life, wherever that may lead? So that's terrifying, because when we're thinking about something, especially like psychotherapy, it seems like it should be formulaic. Because if we're thinking about somebody who's an expert, we're thinking, well, I'm coming to you for you to tell me what to do. I'm coming for ideas, and I'm coming for for your wisdom. Essentially, this is what I'm paying for. This is what my insurance is paying for. So it's kind of frightening to go into, and let's say, seeing somebody who would be classified to one extent or another as an, let's say, existential psychotherapist. Obviously, according to Yalom, it's not its own field, but I'll just use the term. And so it's kind of scary to come in and for that person to say, well, I can't really give you the answers, but what I can do is I can ask you the questions, and I could kind of help you on this road and kind of join you on it. So for you, Kirk, what does that look like sitting with existential therapy or in existential therapy with an existential therapist? Because I assume, all of those fears of uncertainty, they just pretty much pop up and kind of smack you in the face while you're there.
Yeah, and it's very understandable that people are looking to get rid of their pain.
Yeah.
I mean, it's basic. It's understandable, and especially in today's quick fix, instant result world, they have a disposition to do that too, and that's what's expected often. I really feel that the way a therapist engages with the client can make a big difference in terms of whether that client continues to have that mindset of, I just want you to fix me, patch me up, or give me the answer through the formula or the pill, as distinct from, wait, he or she is inviting me into an exploration that I didn't think about before. There's some questions here that maybe I haven't realized, and that would be more central to my problems, to my life, than just getting that quick answer, or maybe the 8 to 12 sessions. Something's opening up here about, how do I really want to live my life? In fact, I think that's one of the two basic questions that are being posed throughout existential therapy, good existential therapy. One is, how is one presently living? And co-creating a space for one to begin to look at that. How are you presently living? What's emerging, and what's blocking you from what's emerging? And then the follow-up from that, the natural follow-up from that, is, how are you willing to live, given how you're presently living? And of course, there's a whole range of ways that those questions can be addressed. They could be addressed at a more programmatic or behavioral level, physiological level. I'm living this way, and I'm willing to live this way, with that behavioral conditioning that you gave me, and I can now go back to my job. I function like I did before, and that's all right. All the way to, man, I am so off. My life is a horror. It's a mess, and I can't keep living this way. What really matters to me is to pursue that project that I've had in mind since I was a kid, or that relationship that's so important to me, that I keep tucking away. So I do try to take what I call an existential integrative approach to my work with clients, because I don't believe that everybody has the desire and capacity to go to those deeper places. However, that said, I think a lot more people have that desire and capacity than is generally realized because of the way conventional practitioners meet their clients. If you meet your client as if you are, the authority with the black bag of answers that you're going to give to the client and basically become the agent for the client's agency in many ways, and the client is desperate for that, then the likelihood is that the client will strongly identify with that, will grab onto that and go with it, and maybe not even think beyond it.
Mm-hmm.
But the great tragedy is that they may well have been gravely shortchanged because they didn't engage with what Yalom calls a fellow traveler, the idea of someone who's relating more authentically to them and in a more vulnerable way, and more of a way of, yeah, you got a lot going on here. I feel it. I'm available to you. I'm available to you to explore it, to go further into it. Yes, I can help you with the immediate. I'll do my best to help you, get through the next few days, get through the next few nights. But it has to do with conveying a certain attitude. It's not only with the words that the therapist says, but it's a kind of attitude that makes available something more, something deeper, something more intimate. It's like a feeling you have about a person that, yeah, I could really talk to this guy. I almost feel disarmed with that person there. And that's a powerful feeling. There's something really important that's emerging here that I gotta check out. But so many people don't even have that because that's not how we train clinicians more and more.
Mm.
We train them more technically or according to manuals or protocols.
Right. And in terms of the way a business model works, I mean, you want to be seen as the authority or the expert because essentially, I mean, you're keeping clients coming. So usually vulnerability, and I mean, I've had this experience too with people before. Vulnerability isn't always very becoming. Some people appreciate it and some people are like, wait, dude, like you get paid for this? Yep.
That's right. That's why I say make it available to the client, not impose it.
Yeah.
But making it available has a lot to do with your presence.
Mm-hmm.
How you're holding and illuminating what is coming up. Mm-hmm. And that presence can also tune the therapist into hopefully how best to relate to this person at this given moment. Mm-hmm. And it may not at all be about exploration. The therapist might have that availability and that can come across to the person, but they both realize very quickly that that's not the route that they need to go at this moment. Maybe they need medication right now after some, substantive discussion about what that would mean. Something to get them through the night, right. Get them through the week, a shelter, maybe they're being beaten. I mean, I'm not a dogmatist around, emphasizing the exploratory per se. I do think we need a lot more of it and need it a lot more available throughout our culture in a whole range of settings, from the setting, the child rearing setting and the household setting, to the educational setting, to the work setting, to even the governmental setting. I do believe we need many more spaces for people to explore, to dialogue, engage in dialogue.
No, for real. I'm with you. I'm with you 100%, right? We definitely need more of that exploration. In fact, as you were speaking before Leon spoke, yeah, there's different levels of communication, right? The surface level, and you could get somewhat deep with somebody, but to get to that level where kind of how you're describing it, you're saying like essentially I'm here for you. If you really need anything from me, please, no judgment at all. Let me know what's bothering you or what's going on, and let's try to work through it. I'll be here to listen to everything you have to say to me. Please, go for it. And then you're just there as a sort of this witnessing presence, essentially. And then they really feel heard by you. And then maybe if you have enough rapport with them, depending where they're at, then after they say what they say, maybe you can then give your piece, what you think about it, and maybe they'll actually work with it, and there's actual real hope there from that level of connection.
Yes.
The surface stuff, I mean, of course, yeah, you could give somebody. I mean, there's different. You could give them tactics. You could give them things they can do behaviorally. You can give them a lot of self-help. Do this body language thing, project your voice, stand up. You could do. Yeah, you could do things like that. For some people it works.
Yeah.
Sure, you're like, oh, okay, this is the right way to be. Oh, that's the way to do it. I had no idea. And then it depends what different people have different blueprints and what they resonate with, but you're right, there's not enough of that connection, and there really needs to be more of that. So
Yeah, and
The problem
existentially,
is, I'm sorry, I was going to say the problem is the programmatic becomes the be all and end all
yeah.
too much in our culture, and that's got to end. We're going to head right down the tubes.
yeah, and I was thinking existentially speaking, I mean, if we're thinking about, again, the unconscious in that kind of context, you would see that if the person's trying to problem solve outside of, let's say, the particular context of the other person asking for advice, or if you're coming to a therapist or a psychiatrist, a lot of that is fundamentally based on the fear of being out of control. And that kind of harkens back to our mortality and our helplessness. So, like, let's say if somebody were to come to me for, I don't know, they would just say something like, hey, I just, need somebody to listen to, or for me to be heard. If I were to, let's say, kind of impose myself on them in some sort of way, that would indicate my sort of not even learned, I would say pretty much fundamental helplessness, that I want to feel as though that I am somebody to this person, that I am important, that I have power, that I have control in my world, that I even have control in their world. And I think a lot of times when we give advice, especially when people don't take it, and that kind of harkens back to our own sense of our mortality. And again, if we're going back and tracing it back to birth, then now all of a sudden it's us re-entering the world from the womb.
You described it really well. We want to feel heard and seen.
Yeah.
It's fundamental.
Yeah.
And so much of that, I believe, is being skimmed over.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's one reason why I call for a national coalition of psychologists or mental health professionals
Mm-hmm.
to be available, especially in underserved communities, marginalized communities,
Yeah. And
or
Kirk,
for longer term, in-depth relationships.
yeah. So what's the progress on that project, if any?
Well, I proposed it as a presidential candidate for the American Psychological Association, and I think a number of people resonated with it, but I'm not sure that we're ready to embrace something like that yet. I do think that the incoming president, Tama is her first name, is concerned about that, and she's going to try to enhance the availability of psychotherapy and psychotherapists in underappreciated, underserved communities, especially communities of color.
Yeah.
So that's hopeful. It's a hopeful direction. I mean, we need a whole mind shift, a cultural shift that embraces something like that, like we embraced, the Works Progress Administration during the Roosevelt years, where we funded, great art projects throughout the country, or the Peace Corps, on the level of the Peace Corps. we need to really prioritize well-being to that degree, that we put some powerful money behind it, like we put powerful money behind so many things that may be leading in the opposite direction. Like, you know, the military. I'm not saying we don't need some of these things at times,
Sure.
for defense, etc., but also subsidizing the wealthiest in the country. I think we need to realize that we are so much more interconnected, and the whole thing's going to come down if we don't make well-being much more of a priority.
Absolutely. And one thing I'm just very curious about is that idea, right, for establishing a coalition of mental health professionals, right? So that idea is very, very interesting to me. Just in your mind, how would it work exactly? Because I think this is a very, very interesting idea, and to at least talk about it, right? It could do wonders, right? You never know. It could become like a sort of a meme, you know, and then maybe actually actualize. Is it that they would sort of be in positions of power and then sort of mediate political issues, or it's not exactly like that? Like what sort of what did you exactly have in mind that they would do?
Well, I had in mind that we could use it as a rallying point within our profession to energize the wealth of mental health expertise that we have throughout the profession, to offer their services maybe even once or twice a week on a voluntary basis to people who can't generally afford those services.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whether that's at the level of individual psychotherapy, and I am talking about more, I call it emotionally restorative relationships.
Mhm.
That's the focus. And by that I mean offering relationships where people feel seen and heard, and that get at the root of their problem.
Mm-hmm.
So that we can bring that kind of substantive relationship from to the clinical setting, to developmental settings, to organizational settings, governmental deliberative settings, prisons, the military, perhaps. I mean, you know, wherever such services are needed, and they're needed in so many places, and also certainly to community settings where there's a great deal of political or cultural divisiveness.
Mm.
And so one of the ways that I suggested facilitating that was bringing highly structured, highly supportive, structured dialogues to people who are ostensibly on very different sides of a political or cultural issue. These humanizing dialogues that Braver Angels is promoting, and that I've been promoting with experiential democracy dialogue. And I think there are so many ways that we could bring our expertise. We have so much expertise to do this. This is what we're trained for. Can we devote a part of our week, even a small fragment? If we did that en masse, what would that look like culturally? And beyond that, actively, aggressively seek funding from the government, from private sources that resonate with the idea of a national core, you know, of psychologists or mental health workers to go out into the country and offer services. I mean, what funding agencies might offer that? Maybe something like Templeton, you know, some of these more forward-looking funding agencies. and even parts of the government may offer that. HHS, Health and Human Services, or the NIMH, National Institute of Health. It would become a focus that hopefully would mobilize both funding from private and governmental sectors and individual volunteerism.
Right. Yeah, and I also love the and I also love the practical individual element of your book. So as we start wrapping up, I want to read some of these suggestions that you have because I think that they're great. So Kurt wrote, following are practical steps readers can take to enhance their experience of awe toward life. And I mean, if you guys want, you can obviously check out our first episode with Kirk, which where we completely, I would say, as thoroughly as possible, we covered the concept of awe. Yeah. So Kirk writes, these steps are drawn from my own and others' paths over many years of grappling with life-enhancing anxiety. So these are the steps. So take time to reflect, be present, develop a capacity to slow down, develop a capacity to savor the moment or seize it, focus on what one loves, practice seeing the big picture, cultivate openness to the mystery of life, including wonder and surprise, cultivate an appreciation for the fact of life, foster an appreciation of pain as sometime teacher, nurture an appreciation of balance, e.g. between fragility and boldness, seek contemplative time alone, seek contemplative time in nature, pursue contemplative time with close others, travel, experience in-depth therapy or meditation, find an awe-based mentor, cultivate an ability to trust the evolving nature of conflict, e.g. this too shall pass, cultivate an ability to trust the evolving nature of life, nurture an ability to give oneself over discerningly to the unknowable, and nurture an ability to trust the ultimately unknowable. So these are phenomenal, and I would say they're definitely different from, the kind of usual escape from life that we do as far as like binging on television and on our phones. So, all right, Alan, as we wrap up, final questions for Kirk.
Yes. If we wanted to follow your work, and of course, buy the book, where could we do that?
So you can do that at University Professors Press. That's the publisher of the book. And they publish beautiful existential humanistic works, which I'm very appreciative of. Or Amazon offers the book in Kindle version as well as paperback and hardback. Barnes and Noble. I think the main online depositories or repositories will offer the book.
Yep. And Kirk, where can we find you on social media?
Well, you can go to my website, kirkjschneider.com. I've got everything virtually.
I got you.
There. I've got a lot on there. Let's see. I have a lot of podcasts on YouTube. Not to at all over the 3 times I've been with you both. You've been terrific.
Of course.
Really, I deeply appreciate our connection. We're talking about connection here. But yes, there are a lot of offerings on YouTube under my name, and occasionally I'm on Twitter, Facebook.
Best place is email, from what I know. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Kirk.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
All right. You too.
All right. That was awesome. All right. So, everyone, if you want to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast. We're on Facebook, Twitter, at Seize_podcast. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. Like, subscribe, hit the bell, on YouTube, and see you next time.